If you walked through the streets of Miami in the mid-1970s, you would have seen something that didn't make sense. The most expensive jewelry stores were packed. Luxury car showrooms were emptying their lots. High-end electronics stores couldn't keep products on the shelves. But the customers weren't American tycoons, European nobles, or Middle Eastern royalty. They were Venezuelans. They arrived in groups, large families, cousins, friends, moving through shopping malls like they owned the place. They laughed loudly, they spent freely, and they never asked the price. Shop owners gave them a nickname, Dame Dos. It meant, give me two. If a Venezuelan liked a pair of Italian shoes, he didn't buy one pair. Give me two. One for me, one for my friend. If he bought a color television, still a luxury at the time, he said, give me two. One for the living room. One for the bathroom. They paid in cash, real cash. Suitcases filled with fresh US dollars, straight from the banks. They bought apartments in Brickell and mansions in Coral Gables without hesitation. They tipped waiters with $100 bills like it was spare change. To Americans struggling with inflation, layoffs, and recession, these people looked unreal, like visitors from a richer planet. That planet was called Venezuela. Back home, Caracas was transforming at breathtaking speed. Cranes filled the skyline. New highways sliced through the city. Glass towers rose where hills once stood. Neon lights turned night into day. Caracas wasn't just growing, it was exploding. It became the only city in South America where the Concorde, the supersonic jet for the global elite, landed regularly. You could leave Paris in the morning and arrive in Caracas in time for a champagne lunch. French restaurants served lobster flown in the same day from Maine. Fashion stores sold clothes from Milan and Paris before they even reached New York or London. Venezuela drank more whiskey per person than any other country on earth. 18-year-old Scotch flowed like water. Money felt endless. People believed they were living in a special moment of history, a moment that would never end. This era got a name, Saudi Venezuela. To the outside world, Venezuela looked like a miracle. It had something rare in Latin America, a stable democracy. Presidents changed peacefully every 5 years. The middle class was growing fast. Families owned cars, homes, and appliances. Life felt modern. And above all, Venezuela had oil. Not a little oil, oceans of oil. The world saw a country that had finally cracked the code of development. A poor nation that had jumped straight into wealth. But what the world didn't see was that this miracle wasn't real. It was an illusion. A golden cage, quietly being built around the country, one bar at a time. The story of this illusion doesn't start in Caracas. It starts thousands of miles away, in the deserts of the Middle East. In October 1973, war broke out between Israel and its neighbors. In response, Arab oil-producing countries did something the world had never seen before. They shut off the oil. Overnight, the price of oil didn't just rise, it exploded. From $3 a barrel to $12, 4 times higher in an instant. It was one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history. Trillions of dollars flowed out of the United States and Europe and into oil-producing nations. Venezuela was one of them. In fact, Venezuela had helped create OPEC itself. The idea came largely from a Venezuelan thinker named Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso. He was a strange figure, brilliant but cautious. He lived simply. He warned again and again that oil was dangerous. He called it the devil's excrement. Oil, he said, would bring waste, corruption, and false confidence. Easy money would destroy discipline. Wealth without effort would rot institutions. But in the 1970s, nobody wanted to hear warnings. The cash registers were too loud. In 1974, a new president took office in Venezuela, Carlos Andrés Pérez, known to everyone as Cap. He was energetic, charismatic, and dramatic. He spoke fast. He walked faster. He wore bold jackets and promised even bolder dreams. And he arrived at the perfect moment. Oil money flooded into the country like a tsunami. The government suddenly had more money than it knew how to handle. The central bank ran out of space to store foreign reserves. Bags of dollars were stacked in hallways. CAP made a promise that captured the nation's imagination. Venezuela, he said, would become a first-world country within 10 years. He called it La Gran Venezuela, the Great Venezuela. The plan was massive. The oil industry would be nationalized. Huge steel factories would rise from the jungle. The world's largest hydroelectric dam would be built. Every student who wanted to study abroad would get a scholarship. Venezuela would leap into the future and lead Latin America with it. For a while, it worked. Thousands of young Venezuelans were sent to the best universities in the world: Harvard, Oxford, the Sorbonne. Children of taxi drivers and housemaids suddenly found themselves studying overseas, fully funded by the state. It felt like a beautiful dream, a country investing in its future. But behind the celebrations, something invisible was going wrong. The economy wasn't getting stronger. It was quietly being hollowed out. This is where the trap begins. But at the height of the party, almost no one noticed. Because when money feels endless, warnings feel unnecessary. And Venezuela had never felt richer. At first, the problems were invisible. On the surface, everything still looked perfect. Money was flowing. Construction never stopped. Imports poured into the country. Supermarkets were full. Airports were busy. Miami was still crowded with Venezuelan shoppers. But beneath the shine, the foundation of the economy was starting to rot. The first crack came from something that felt like a blessing: the currency. Because of the oil boom, dollars flooded into Venezuela. To keep things stable, the government fixed the exchange rate. One US dollar was worth 4.30 bolivars. It didn't change, ever. The bolivar became one of the strongest currencies in the world. People trusted it completely. You could walk into a bank in Caracas with bolivars and walk out with dollars instantly. No paperwork, no limits. It felt like proof that Venezuela had made it, but this strength was fake. And it came at a terrible cost. When a currency is very strong, foreign products become cheap. Too cheap. Why grow corn in Venezuela when corn from Iowa costs less? Why raise cattle when imported beef is cheaper? Why make shoes, clothes, or appliances when European imports are a bargain? Slowly, Venezuelan production stopped making sense. Farmers abandoned their land. Fields went empty. Agriculture collapsed. People left the countryside and moved into the cities, building shacks on the hillsides, depending on government handouts. Factories shut down. Workshops disappeared. Venezuela stopped producing and started importing. Everything was imported: food, clothes, cars, electronics. Even construction materials were imported. Incredibly, Venezuela even imported sand to build its skyscrapers, because foreign sand was considered better. This was the first part of the trap. Import addiction. The country was living off oil money and buying everything else from the outside world. As long as oil prices stayed high, it felt fine. But it made Venezuela fragile, dangerously fragile. The second crack was much harder to see and far more destructive. It was debt. This raises an obvious question. Why would a country drowning in cash need to borrow money? The answer lies outside Venezuela. The oil money that flooded into Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran didn't just sit there. These countries couldn't spend it fast enough. So they parked it in what they believed were the safest places on earth: the big banks of New York and London, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America. Suddenly, these banks were sitting on mountains of cash. And banks have a problem when they have too much cash. They don't make money by holding it. They make money by lending it, so they needed borrowers. At the time, the US economy was weak, inflation was high, growth was slow. American companies weren't borrowing, so the bankers looked elsewhere. They looked south. They looked at Latin America. And one country stood out immediately: Venezuela. A stable democracy, huge oil reserves, a strong currency, endless income, or so it seemed. To the bankers, Venezuela looked like the safest bet in the developing world. So they didn't wait to be asked. They flew in. Executives in tailored suits boarded planes in New York and landed in Caracas. They stayed in luxury hotels. They drank expensive scotch. They met ministers and officials. They came with briefcases full of loan offers. They told a beautiful story. Oil prices, they said, would rise forever. $12 today, 20 tomorrow, 50 after that, then 100. Borrow now, they said. Inflation will erase the debt. Rising oil revenue will make repayment painless. This isn't a burden, it's an opportunity, free money, leverage. And the Venezuelan government believed them. Borrowing began slowly, then it accelerated. Loans were taken to fund giant infrastructure projects that always went over budget. Loans were used to keep imports cheap so the population stayed happy. Loans quietly filled the gaps left by corruption, because corruption was everywhere. With so much money and so little oversight, the system became sticky. Contracts went to friends. Fake companies appeared overnight. Money vanished into offshore accounts. A small group of businessmen became unimaginably rich simply by being close to power. They were later called the 12 Apostles. They built palaces in Caracas. They bought yachts and private islands. They lived like royalty, and the debt kept growing. But the most dangerous part wasn't the size of the loans. It was the fine print. The banks were not foolish. They knew oil prices might not rise forever, so they protected themselves. They wrote the loans with floating interest rates. This meant Venezuela's payments weren't fixed. They were tied to interest rates in the United States and London. If rates went up there, Venezuela would pay more automatically. Almost nobody paid attention. In the mid-1970s, interest rates were low. Money was cheap. The party continued. The government built massive projects. The Guri Dam, one of the largest hydroelectric dams on Earth. The Caracas Metro, cleaner and more modern than many systems in the developed world. Huge industrial zones carved out of the jungle. In 1976, the oil industry was nationalized. The state oil company was born. Flags were raised. Speeches were made. Venezuela declared economic independence, but the independence was an illusion. By the end of the 1970s, Venezuela owed billions of dollars to the same banks holding its oil money. The country was borrowing its own wealth back, paying interest to access it. A perfect trap. And still, most people felt rich. The culture began to change. Hard work stopped being the goal. Government jobs became the prize. The public sector exploded in size. Entire offices existed just to exist. People were paid to do nothing. The state became everything: employer, provider, protector, and inequality deepened. While the middle class flew to Miami, the poor watched from the hills. Gasoline was almost free. Bread was cheap, but schools decayed. Hospitals collapsed. The future was being traded for comfort. Few noticed the warning signs, because the illusion was powerful. And illusions only break when reality finally arrives. At the end of the 1970s, the music was still playing. But somewhere far away, someone was already reaching for the switch. By the end of the 1970s, Venezuela still looked rich. The highways were packed with American cars. Nightclubs in Caracas were full. Construction cranes still dotted the skyline. The government was spending like tomorrow didn't matter. But underneath it all, the system was shaking. The first tremor came from the oil market itself. The world was changing. New oil fields in the North Sea and Alaska were coming online. Western countries, burned by the oil shock of the 1970s, were using energy more efficiently. Demand slowed. Supply increased. Oil prices stopped rising, then they began to wobble. For a country built on the belief that oil would always go up, this was terrifying. In 1979, a new president took office, Luis Herrera Campins. When he looked at the country's finances, he understood immediately how bad things were. In his first speech, he said something that cut through the illusion. I am inheriting a mortgaged country. The numbers were brutal. For every dollar coming in, more than two were going out. Debt payments were rising. Imports were draining dollars. Corruption had hollowed out the state. But stopping the machine was almost impossible. Cut spending, and people would riot. End subsidies, and the illusion would collapse. Admit the truth, and the political system might not survive. So the government did what trapped governments always do. They borrowed more. New loans paid interest on old loans. Debt covered debt. The country was playing a dangerous game, hoping oil prices would save them in time. They didn't. Far away from Caracas, in Washington, D.C., a decision was being made that would change everything. A tall, serious man named Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve. His mission was simple and brutal: destroy inflation in the United States. Inflation was eating the dollar alive. Prices were rising fast. Confidence was falling. Volcker believed there was only one cure: raise interest rates aggressively. When Volcker acted, the effect was immediate and violent. U.S. interest rates shot upward, higher than anyone had seen before. Eventually, they reached nearly 20%. For the American economy, it was painful but survivable. For Venezuela, it was catastrophic. Remember the loans. Remember the floating interest rates. Overnight, Venezuela's debt payments exploded. Loans taken when interest rates were 5% now demanded payments 4 times higher. At the exact same moment, oil prices weakened. Income was falling, expenses were skyrocketing. The trap snapped shut. The government tried to pretend nothing was wrong. They burned through foreign reserves to defend the currency. They held the exchange rate at 4.30 to the dollar. They wanted people to keep believing. They wanted Miami trips to continue. They wanted whiskey to keep flowing. They wanted the illusion to survive. But math doesn't care about illusions. Every day, millions of dollars left the country. Wealthy Venezuelans moved their money to Switzerland, Miami, and Caribbean banks. Investors panicked. Capital flight became a flood. The same elites who had profited most during the boom were the first to leave, carrying their fortunes with them. Then came the breaking point. Friday, February 18, 1983. The government finally admitted defeat. They could no longer defend the currency. The bolivar was devalued. The fixed exchange rate, the symbol of stability, pride, and wealth, vanished overnight. Multiple exchange rates replaced it, but the truth was simple. The currency collapsed. Imagine waking up and realizing your savings are suddenly worth half as much. Imagine owning a business with debt in dollars, and that debt triples overnight. Imagine being a student abroad, living on a government scholarship, when the payments stop and your credit card is declined. That was the shock. The era of Dame DOS ended in a single morning. Concorde flights were canceled. Miami shopping trips disappeared. The middle class, once confident and carefree, suddenly felt poor and exposed. The party was over, and the hangover was just beginning. The 1980s became known as Latin America's lost decade. For Venezuela, it was a slow collapse. The government was broke. International banks stopped lending. Venezuela became a risk, not a promise. And the same banks that had pushed loans so eagerly in the 1970s now showed no mercy. They demanded repayment. They demanded cuts. They demanded reforms. Teams of lawyers and accountants replaced the smiling bankers. Compassion disappeared. Balance sheets mattered more than people. Infrastructure built during the boom began to decay. Roads cracked. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Schools fell apart. The great Venezuela was dissolving. By the late 1980s, the situation was desperate. And the man who had led the country during its golden age returned, promising salvation. Carlos Andrés Pérez ran for president again. He spoke of the good times. He promised abundance. He sold hope. And the people, exhausted and afraid, believed him. They elected him in a landslide. But when he returned to power in 1989, he found the truth waiting. The treasury was empty. There was no money left. Only one option remained: the IMF. When Carlos Andrés Pérez returned to the presidency in 1989, reality hit immediately. There was no money. The international reserves were almost empty. The government couldn't pay its bills. Banks refused to lend. Venezuela, once treated like a star client, was now seen as a risk. There was only one place left to go: the International Monetary Fund. To many Venezuelans, the IMF was an abstract name, a distant institution, but what came next would change the country forever. The IMF offered a rescue package, $4.5 billion to stabilize the economy. But this money came with conditions, very hard conditions. The deal required a complete reversal of the old system. Price controls had to be removed. State companies had to be privatized. Government spending had to be cut, and most dangerously of all, the gasoline subsidy had to end. For decades, cheap fuel wasn't just an economic policy. It was a symbol. Gasoline was cheaper than water. It was proof that oil wealth belonged to the people. Raising fuel prices was unthinkable. It was political suicide, but Pérez had no choice. Trapped by debt and pressure from foreign lenders, he accepted the IMF plan. The program was called El Gran Virage, the Great Turn. On television, Pérez spoke directly to the nation. He told people sacrifices were necessary. He said pain today would bring stability tomorrow. Many didn't believe him. Some didn't understand. Others felt betrayed. On February 27, 1989, the new prices went into effect. Gasoline became more expensive. Public transportation followed immediately. Bus fares rose overnight. In the commuter towns outside Caracas, people woke up for work and realized they couldn't afford the bus ride. It started small, a protest in the town of Goranes. Angry voices, shouting, burning tires. Then something snapped. Like a spark falling into dry grass, the anger spread. By midday, the protests reached Caracas. People poured down from the hillside slums into the city center. But this wasn't an organized march. There were no leaders, no demands. This was raw rage. Supermarkets were looted. Electronics stores were emptied. Shopping malls were overrun. People carried food, televisions, and appliances on their backs. They weren't stealing luxury. They were taking back what they believed had been stolen from them. The symbols of the Saudi era, imports, abundance, consumer goods, were being torn apart by the very people who had been excluded from them. This explosion of fury became known as the Caracazo. For 3 days, Caracas burned. The police were overwhelmed. They lost control within hours. The government panicked. Carlos Andrés Pérez made a decision that would define his legacy forever. He suspended constitutional rights. He sent the army into the streets, and he gave the order to fire. Soldiers with automatic weapons confronted civilians. Shots rang out across the city. Bullets tore through crowds. Shantytowns were raided. Gunfire echoed through neighborhoods that had already been broken by poverty. The repression was brutal and chaotic. The official death toll was around 300. Human rights groups believed the real number was far higher, possibly thousands. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Families never got answers. The Caracazo changed Venezuela permanently. It shattered the trust between the people and the democratic system. It destroyed the credibility of the traditional political parties. It ended the myth that Venezuela was different, that it was immune to collapse. The illusion of the 1970s had led directly to bloodshed in the streets. The wealth had been a lie. The aftermath was slow and painful. The economy never recovered. Poverty deepened. Infrastructure decayed further. The middle class shrank. Hope faded. And something darker took root. A deep anger. People felt cheated. They believed their country's wealth had been stolen by foreign banks and local elites working together. They looked at unfinished buildings and rusting factories and saw monuments to betrayal. They stopped believing in politicians. They stopped believing in the system. It was in this atmosphere, broken, angry, humiliated, that a new figure emerged. A young military officer. His name was Hugo Chavez. 3 years after the Caracazo, in 1992, he led a coup attempt. It failed, but his message did not. He spoke of stolen oil wealth. He spoke of corruption. He spoke of betrayal. And millions listened, because he wasn't just talking about politics. He was talking about the broken promise of Saudi Venezuela. The country would never be the same again, but the story wasn't over yet. Because the final lesson of this era, the real meaning of the rise and fall, still remained to be understood. By the early 1990s, the damage was already done. Venezuela had survived the crash, the riots, and the repression, but it had not escaped the consequences. The country that once believed it was destined for greatness was now trapped in decline. What remained was not just economic ruin. It was a psychological scar. An entire generation had grown up believing wealth was natural, permanent, and guaranteed. That belief had been shattered, and when illusions collapse, they leave anger behind. The tragedy of Saudi Venezuela was not a lack of money, it was the misuse of it. The country had oil revenues that most nations could only dream of, but money alone is not wealth. Wealth is built on productivity, institutions, and discipline. Venezuela skipped those steps. Oil allowed the state to survive without taxing its citizens. And because the government didn't depend on the people for revenue, it didn't need their consent or trust. Accountability weakened, institutions decayed. When the oil money flowed, the system held together. When it stopped, everything collapsed. The global banking system played its role. During the boom, international banks earned massive fees arranging loans, holding deposits, and recycling oil money. When the crisis hit, those same banks were protected by IMF programs that forced Venezuela to squeeze its own population to keep paying interest. The banks survived. The people paid the price. The political system never recovered from the Caracazo. Democracy, once Venezuela's greatest pride, lost its legitimacy. Traditional parties became symbols of corruption and failure. Voters no longer believed in gradual reform. They wanted revenge. They wanted someone to punish the system. That hunger opened the door to radical change. Hugo Chavez didn't rise because he was a brilliant economist or a master politician. He rose because he understood the emotional wound. He spoke about dignity. He spoke about stolen wealth. He spoke about betrayal, and he promised to destroy the old order. To millions of Venezuelans, he wasn't a threat, he was justice. But the deeper lesson of Saudi Venezuela goes far beyond one country. It is a warning. Easy money creates illusions. Illusions destroy discipline. Discipline is what builds nations. When wealth comes from the ground instead of from work, institutions weaken. When consumption replaces production, debt replaces strength. When leaders believe booms are permanent, crashes become inevitable. Venezuela didn't fail because it had oil. It failed because it believed oil made it immune to reality. Today, if you walk through Caracas, the past is still visible. You see the futuristic buildings of the 1970s, cracked, stained, abandoned. You see half-finished towers standing like gravestones. You see highways built for prosperity now struggling under neglect. And in the memories of older Venezuelans, you still hear the stories. The days when the Concorde landed in Caracas. The days when the Bolivar was stronger than the dollar. The days when Give Me felt normal. Those memories hurt now, because they know the truth. The wealth was not earned, it was borrowed. Saudi Venezuela was not a golden age. It was a credit card, and the bill came due with interest. The banks were paid, the elites escaped, the politicians took their share, but the people inherited the debt in poverty, migration, and a broken country. This is the story of Icarus, a nation that flew too close to the sun on wings made of oil and borrowed money. For a moment, it touched the sky. Then it fell, and the fall lasted generations. This is finance historian time. If you want to understand how booms become disasters and why history keeps repeating itself, subscribe. Because the next illusion is already forming. And only those who study the past will see it coming.